The arrival of Miss Susan Marley. It was a crisp Monday morning in downtown Atlanta, and the city was alive with the usual bustle of activity. Cars honked as they made their way through the busy streets, pedestrians hurriedly walked to their destinations, and the tall skyscrapers cast long shadows over the sidewalks. In one of the most prestigious financial districts, Blue Ridge Bank stood tall and imposing, its gleaming glass facade reflecting the morning sun. Inside the bank, the air was cool and calm. It was the start of a new week, and everyone was preparing for what they hoped would be a productive day. Behind the polished counters, employees moved with efficiency, greeting customers, processing transactions, and providing services to those who came in. But today, the atmosphere in Blue Ridge Bank was charged with a quiet tension. The reason was simple. It was Miss Susan Marley's first day as the new branch manager. Susan had only recently moved to Atlanta from a smaller town, having been promoted to the position of branch manager after years of hard work. It was the kind of opportunity that came once in a lifetime, and she knew this was her moment to prove herself. She was eager, confident, and above all, determined to show the higher-ups that she was capable of handling the demands of such a prestigious role. She had spent countless nights studying the bank's protocols, its client base, and its most valued customers. Susan believed she was ready. This was her time. As she walked into her office early that morning, Susan couldn't help but notice the sense of excitement and anticipation in the air. Her staff, though polite, seemed to regard her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. They were aware of her ambitious nature, and they knew she would demand excellence from them. Susan was well aware of her own potential, but she also understood that she had to earn their respect and trust. In the back of her mind, she reminded herself that today had to be flawless. She had to make an impact, and she knew how important first impressions were. As the clock ticked closer to 9:00 a.m., the door of her office opened, and a middle-aged man entered the bank. He was dressed casually, wearing a simple collared shirt and dark jeans, a stark contrast to the sharply dressed professionals who filled the bank's lobby. His demeanor was calm, and he moved with a quiet confidence that made Susan take notice. She straightened up, ready to begin her day. The man walked up to her counter, where she had stationed herself, ready to greet the first customer of the day. His voice was deep and smooth as he said, "Good morning. I'd like to deposit a large sum of money into my account." Susan briefly sized him up, scanning him from head to toe. His attire didn't scream wealth or success, but she wasn't one to judge on appearances alone. However, something about his request caught her off guard. Depositing a large sum of money was a relatively rare occurrence, and she could tell this wasn't going to be a standard transaction. "Of course," she replied with a practiced smile. "We'll need to verify your account first." The man nodded, unfazed by her formal tone. He handed her a slip of paper with his account details. Susan glanced at the paper, entering the information into the computer system. As the details flashed across her screen, she froze. The numbers on her screen were far beyond what she had expected. The amount was staggering. The man was about to deposit $200 million. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment, she found herself speechless. This couldn't be right. How could a man dressed so simply be about to deposit such a colossal sum? There had to be some mistake, she thought. Maybe the account was compromised. Or maybe, just maybe, this was some elaborate scam. Trying to mask her surprise, Susan leaned in, narrowing her eyes as she examined the account details again. She lowered her voice and asked, "Are you sure these details are correct?" The man, unfazed, responded calmly, "Yes, they are." "Okay," Susan muttered, trying to keep her composure. She could feel the weight of his presence, but something didn't sit right with her. "You'll need to prepare for the deposit," she said, still eyeing the man suspiciously. He gave a slight nod and replied, "It's a transfer of $200 million. The money should be coming in shortly." Susan's eyes widened slightly, but she tried to remain professional. Her instincts were telling her that something was wrong, and as a new manager, She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. "Look," Susan said in a clipped tone, "we don't tolerate scams here. If this is some sort of joke, I suggest you leave before I call security." The man's expression remained unchanged. He didn't seem angry or upset. Rather, he appeared calm and collected, as if he had dealt with situations like this before. "This is not a joke," he said firmly. "Perhaps you'd like to see my business card." With a smooth motion, the man opened his briefcase and produced a sleek, professional business card. He handed it to Susan, but she barely glanced at it before pushing it away. "No need," she said curtly. "Scammers always have fake cards. You can't fool me." Susan's voice was growing sharper, her frustration rising. "You probably think I don't know how these things work, but I do. People like you always try to game the system, and I'm not having it." As she spoke, the room fell into an uneasy silence. A few nearby customers exchanged glances, and some whispered to each other. But the man remained calm, not giving an inch. He simply replied, "I'm not scamming you. You're making a mistake." Susan's patience was quickly wearing thin. She pointed a finger at the man and said with conviction, "People like you always try to pull something. You think you can just walk in here and claim to have millions. Get out." The tension in the bank was palpable now. Some customers were staring, others were quietly shaking their heads, but no one dared to speak up. It was then that the door to the bank opened again. A tall man, dressed in an impeccable suit, entered. His arrival went almost unnoticed, but his presence immediately commanded attention. He walked with purpose toward the counter, where Susan and the man were engaged in an increasingly heated exchange. The stranger's voice cut through the tension like a knife as he cleared his throat. "What's going on here?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Susan, momentarily flustered, turned to face him. "Mr. Taylor," she stammered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "This man claims to have $200 million to deposit. I was just about to call security." The man, now identified as Mr. Taylor, raised an eyebrow and glanced from Susan to the man in front of her. "And why would you call security for that?" he asked, his voice smooth but carrying a tone of authority. Susan opened her mouth, but Mr. Taylor was already walking toward the man. "You know him?" she asked in a moment of confusion. Mr. Taylor turned to the man with a look of recognition dawning on his face. "Of course I do," he said warmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to Mr. James Daniels, the owner of Daniels Innovations and our bank's largest investor." Susan's eyes widened as she suddenly realized the magnitude of the mistake she had just made. Her mind raced, trying to process the information. Mr. James Daniels, the man she had just insulted, was not just any client. He was the person responsible for keeping the bank afloat during the last financial crisis. A deep sense of regret washed over her as she opened her mouth to apologize, but before she could speak, Mr. Taylor's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Let me make one thing clear, Susan," he said, turning to her. "Mr. Daniels isn't just a client. His investments are the reason this bank survived the last financial crisis. Without him, we wouldn't even be here today." Susan's face drained of color. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had just publicly accused one of the bank's biggest investors of being a scammer. And now, there was no way to take it back. Mr. Taylor turned to the man, his voice now full of respect. "Mr. Daniels, I deeply apologize for the treatment you've received today. This is unacceptable." As the words sank in, the reality of what had just occurred hit Susan hard. She was paralyzed with embarrassment. How had she let this happen? How had she misjudged the situation so completely? But Mr. Taylor wasn't done. He turned back to Susan and addressed her directly. "You've been here for barely 2 weeks, and this is how you treat our clients," he said, his voice cold with disappointment. I didn't know," Susan stammered, but Mr. Taylor wasn't listening. "Didn't know," he repeated, incredulity in his voice. What exactly does someone with $200 million look like, Susan? Do you think they wear suits and ties to prove their worth? She said nothing, her head hanging in shame. The unraveling of Susan Marley's career. The tension in the bank was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone had fallen silent, waiting for something to happen. The customers who had been quietly observing the exchange between Susan and the man now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their attention fully focused on the unfolding drama. Some customers exchanged whispered comments, while others looked at Susan with a mixture of disbelief and judgment. Susan stood there, her face flushed with embarrassment, as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. Mr. Taylor, her superior, had just confirmed that the man she had accused of scamming was not only a legitimate client but one of the most influential and powerful investors the bank had ever had. Her entire professional world, carefully constructed over the past 2 weeks, seemed to be crumbling before her eyes. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. The crowd that had gathered in the bank appeared to blur in her peripheral vision, and all that mattered was the man standing in front of her, Mr. Taylor, the bank's senior executive, who was now staring at her with a look of disappointment so deep it seemed to pierce her very soul. She could feel her palms begin to sweat, her heart racing as the weight of the situation settled in. How had it all gone so wrong? She had been so determined to prove herself as capable, to show that she belonged in this position, that she had completely overlooked the very essence of her role, to treat every client with dignity and respect, no matter their appearance or demeanor. And now, it was too late. Mr. Taylor's voice broke the silence, cutting through her thoughts like a harsh reprimand. "Let me make one thing clear, Susan," Mr. Taylor said, his voice firm but not raised. "Mr. Daniels is not just a client. He is the reason Blue Ridge Bank exists today. If it weren't for his investments during the financial crisis, we wouldn't have survived. You should know that. You should have known better than to assume someone like him would walk in here and be dismissed because of how he looked. I trusted you to represent this bank with the professionalism and respect our clients deserve, but you failed." Susan's knees felt weak, and she instinctively took a step back, her chest tight as the words reverberated in her mind. She had trusted her instincts, believing she was doing the right thing by questioning the legitimacy of the transaction. But now, with everything laid bare, it felt like a slap to the face. She had misjudged him, misjudged an important figure who had helped the bank weather a financial storm. And now, she was paying the price. Mr. Taylor didn't wait for her to respond. He continued, his voice cold with frustration. "You've been here for less than 2 weeks, and already you've shown how little you understand about what this bank represents. I thought you had the potential to lead this branch, but I've seen enough to know that you're not ready. Not by a long shot." Susan's face turned pale as the reality of his words sank in. "I'm not ready. I failed." "Please," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean. I thought. I didn't know who he was. That's the problem." "Susan," Mr. Taylor interrupted, his tone sharp. "You don't take the time to learn who your clients are. You don't make the effort to understand them before making assumptions. That's not leadership. That's ignorance." A heavy silence hung in the air. The other bank employees, who had been quietly watching the confrontation, seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next move. Susan could feel their eyes on her, their judgment. Some of them looked sympathetic, but many wore expressions of disbelief, as if they had already lost all faith in her ability to lead. Mr. Taylor finally turned to Mr. Daniels, who had remained calm throughout the entire exchange, his expression unreadable. He had not once raised his voice, even as Susan had insulted him. And for that, Susan couldn't help but feel a sense of awe mixed with shame. She had underestimated him, and he had handled the situation with grace, unlike her. "I am deeply sorry for what has happened here," Mr. Taylor said, addressing Mr. Daniels. "This is not the kind of experience you should expect when you visit our branch. I will ensure that this matter is addressed immediately." Mr. Daniels nodded politely, his expression still composed. "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Taylor. I understand that mistakes happen, but I hope that this incident will be a wake-up call for the entire team." Susan watched as Mr. Taylor gestured for her to leave, the unspoken message clear. She had no place in this bank anymore. Her career, which had been so full of promise just hours earlier, was now hanging by a thread. "That will be all, Susan," Mr. Taylor said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Please clear out your desk. You're no longer employed here." Susan's stomach dropped, her mind racing as she processed the finality of his words. She felt the heat of embarrassment rise to her face as she nodded, trying to fight back the tears that threatened to spill. She had failed. She had let her ambition, her desire to prove herself, cloud her judgment, and now she was paying the ultimate price. She turned to gather her things, each movement slow and deliberate, as if she were in a trance. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The crowd of customers in the bank, who had been silent witnesses to her downfall, seemed to whisper amongst themselves. She could hear the murmur of their voices, the judgment in their eyes, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered now except the crushing realization that her career was over before it had even begun. As she collected her personal items from her desk, the cold reality of what she had just done settled in. She thought about her family, who had supported her through years of schooling. The sleepless nights and the long hours of hard work. She had promised them that this new job would be her stepping stone to something greater, to a future filled with success. But now she had nothing. The thought of her parents' disappointment was almost too much to bear. She walked out of her office, her head hanging low. She avoided eye contact with the employees who were still in the bank, all of them watching her with expressions ranging from pity to disdain. As she passed by Mr. Daniels, she caught a glimpse of his face, calm, composed, yet with an undeniable air of disappointment. The weight of that look felt heavier than any reprimand Mr. Taylor could give. She had not only embarrassed herself, but she had also embarrassed the entire bank. She had allowed her assumptions to cloud her professionalism, and now she would be remembered as the manager who couldn't see past her own prejudices. Outside the bank, the world seemed to move on, indifferent to her downfall. The traffic hummed in the distance, the pedestrians continued on their way, and the towering skyscrapers stood tall, unaffected by the drama that had just unfolded within their walls. But Susan was different now. Her future, once so bright, now seemed uncertain. She had learned a hard lesson, one that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The lesson was simple but profound. Never judge someone by their appearance or how they carry themselves. You may never know the true worth of a person until you look beyond the surface. As Susan stood outside Blue Ridge Bank, her heart heavy with regret, she realized that she would have to rebuild her life from the ground up. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but it was one she would have to walk, alone with the knowledge that she had learned the most valuable lesson of her career, albeit the hard way. The thought that this might be the end of her career at Blue Ridge Bank was a bitter pill to swallow. But for the first time in her life, Susan understood what it meant to truly face the consequences of her actions. And as she walked away from the bank, the lessons from this day would stay with her, shaping her into the person she needed to become, a person who would never make the same mistake again. The ripple effect of Susan Marley's mistake. The days following Susan Marley's dismissal from Blue Ridge Bank were a blur of regret and self-reflection. Her world had unraveled so quickly, and now she found herself grappling with a stark reality. She had made a fatal mistake, one that not only cost her the career she had worked so hard to build, but also shattered her sense of self-confidence. The failure was all-encompassing, and she felt as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure of how to move forward. For the first time in her life, Susan realized that she wasn't invincible. She had been so focused on proving herself, on climbing the corporate ladder, that she had failed to grasp the deeper truth. Success was not about ambition alone. It was about understanding, empathy, and the ability to see people for who they truly were, not just what they appeared to be on the surface. As Susan sat in her small apartment that evening, surrounded by the remnants of a life that now seemed distant and foreign, she replayed the events of that fateful day over and over again in her mind. She could still hear Mr. Taylor's voice, cold and unforgiving, as he fired her. She could still see the look of disappointment on Mr. Daniel's face, his calm exterior masking the humiliation he must have felt. And yet, the most painful image that lingered in her mind was the crowd of customers, the ones who had witnessed her public disgrace. They had all seen her fall, and now she had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything that could go wrong when one allowed prejudice and assumption to take root. Susan had always prided herself on being a hard worker, a dedicated professional who never backed down from a challenge. But this experience had knocked her down in a way that she hadn't expected. She felt the sting of shame every time she thought about the way she had treated Mr. Daniels. Her mind wandered to the fact that she had never once taken the time to learn about the bank's largest investor, the person whose contributions had saved the institution from collapse. Instead, she had judged him based on his appearance, a mistake that was now impossible to undo. Days turned into weeks, and Susan found herself unable to escape the grip of her own self-doubt. She spent hours on the phone with former colleagues and friends, trying to explain what had happened, but it was clear that the damage had been done. Word of her disgrace had spread quickly, and soon even her closest allies began to distance themselves. It was hard for them to reconcile the woman they had known with the one who had made such a glaring error in judgment. Even her family, who had always been her biggest supporters, couldn't mask their disappointment. Her mother, who had always believed in her potential, told her, "Susan, you've always been so careful, so ambitious. I never thought you'd let something like this happen. You need to learn to listen to people, to understand their worth beyond the surface." Her father, too, expressed his concerns, urging her to take a step back and reassess her priorities. Susan knew they were right. She had become so consumed with the idea of success that she had overlooked the most important lesson of all: humility. The idea that one could rise to the top without stepping on others, without making assumptions or misjudging people, was something she had failed to grasp. And now, that failure seemed insurmountable. The pressure to pick up the pieces of her shattered career weighed heavily on her. Each time she looked at job listings, she felt a sense of hopelessness. How could she possibly find another job after what had happened? No matter where she went, people would know about her firing, and the stain on her professional reputation would be difficult, if not impossible, to erase. But amidst the overwhelming despair, there was a small flicker of resolve deep within her. Susan wasn't one to give up easily. She had been knocked down, yes, but she still had the will to rise again. She realized that, in order to move forward, she had to confront the mistakes of her past head-on. She couldn't let them define her. One afternoon, as Susan sat in a local cafe, sipping her coffee and trying to clear her mind, she received a surprising call. It was from Mr. Taylor, the very man who had fired her just weeks earlier. She had assumed that their paths would never cross again, that her professional life had ended in disgrace. But now, here was a call from him, a chance, perhaps, to redeem herself. With trembling hands, she answered the phone. "Susan, it's Mr. Taylor." His voice was steady, though she could detect a hint of something else, perhaps regret or something more. "I know you've been through a lot, and I've been thinking about our conversation. After everything that happened, I wanted to reach out to you. We both know that you made a mistake, but I also know that you have the potential to learn from it." Susan's heart skipped a beat. She had not expected this, but she quickly composed herself. "Mr. Taylor, I don't know what to say. I'm ashamed of what happened. I ruined everything. I understand if you don't want to speak to me." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "I'm not calling to rehash the past, Susan, but what I want you to understand is that everyone makes mistakes. It's how we handle those mistakes that defines us. I think you've learned that already, but I wanted to give you a chance to prove it. We have a new project coming up, and I'm looking for someone who can help lead it. Someone with your skills, but who's also willing to listen and learn." Susan blinked in disbelief. A chance. After everything she had done. Was this really happening? "You're offering me a job?" she asked cautiously, her voice filled with doubt. "I'm offering you an opportunity," Mr. Taylor replied, his tone now softer, more understanding. "If you're willing to take it, we can move forward. I don't expect you to be perfect, but I do expect you to respect the lessons you've learned. I'm giving you a second chance, Susan." Tears welled in Susan's eyes as she sat there, stunned by his words. She had expected to be written off completely. But instead, Mr. Taylor was offering her a path forward. This was her chance to redeem herself, to rebuild her career, and more importantly, to rebuild the person she had once hoped to become. "I won't let you down," she said, her voice filled with determination. "I'll work harder than I ever have before." "Good," Mr. Taylor said, his voice firm once more. "Then we'll talk soon. I'll have someone from HR contact you with the details." As Susan hung up the phone, she felt a sense of disbelief wash over her. She had been given a second chance, but more than that, she had been given the opportunity to prove to herself that she was capable of growth, that her mistakes did not define her. The months that followed were not easy. Susan had to work twice as hard to prove herself, to rebuild her reputation and restore the trust that had been broken. She poured herself into the project that Mr. Taylor had offered her, immersing herself in every detail, working closely with the team, and listening to the clients. With each passing day, she learned to see beyond the surface and to treat everyone with the respect they deserved. She found herself growing in ways she hadn't expected. The lessons she had learned from her failure became the foundation for her success. She began to understand that leadership wasn't about proving one's worth to others, but about empowering others to reach their full potential. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being human. Through her hard work and dedication, Susan earned back the respect of her colleagues. But more importantly, she earned something even more valuable, her own self-respect. She knew she still had a long way to go, but she also knew that she was on the right path. The ripple effect of her mistake had been profound, but it had also brought her closer to the person she needed to be. And as she looked toward the future, Susan Marley no longer saw her failure as the end of her career. It was, in fact, the beginning of something much greater. Redemption and the road to recovery. In the weeks that followed Susan Marley's second chance at Blue Ridge Bank, she found herself in a constant state of self-reflection. It wasn't just about proving her worth to Mr. Taylor or her colleagues. It was about proving to herself that she had truly changed. The emotional toll of the mistake she had made, and the fallout from it, had pushed her into an intense period of self-examination. Could she really overcome the bias and assumptions that had shaped her actions? Could she grow into a better version of the ambitious, driven woman who had once been so certain of her path? The weight of her previous mistakes still clung to her like a heavy cloak, and every day she worked diligently to peel it away. She immersed herself in the project that Mr. Taylor had assigned to her, but it was not just the technical work that absorbed her attention. She had to relearn how to approach people, how to understand them, and how to treat them with respect. It was a humbling experience, but one that she had to embrace if she was going to truly recover from the errors of her past. The first few weeks after returning to work were difficult. Susan had a long way to go before she could regain the trust of her colleagues and clients. There were moments when she doubted whether she was cut out for the challenges ahead, but there was a part of her that refused to give up. She knew that this was her opportunity to show that she could rise above her failures. One afternoon, as she sat at her desk in the bank's spacious yet sterile office, going through some paperwork, she was interrupted by a knock on the door. She looked up to see one of her colleagues, Claire, standing there with a hesitant smile on her face. "Hey, Susan, got a minute?" Claire asked, stepping inside. Susan, a little surprised by the unexpected visit, nodded. "Of course, Claire. What's up?" Claire walked in and sat down across from Susan's desk. There was a brief, almost awkward silence before Claire spoke again. "I just wanted to say something," Claire began. about what happened with Mr. Daniels. She paused, her expression thoughtful. I know it's been tough for you, and I've been watching you work these past few weeks. I just want to say, I'm impressed. You've been really putting in the effort, and I respect that. Susan's face flushed with embarrassment, but she managed to smile weakly. Thank you, Claire. It's been a humbling experience. I know I messed up, and I'm trying my best to make up for it. I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm committed to learning. Claire nodded, her smile widening slightly. I can see that, and I think the rest of the team can too. We've all made mistakes. None of us are perfect, but what matters is how we handle them, and whether we're willing to change. You've been doing that, Susan. You're showing us that you're capable of growth. Susan felt a wave of relief wash over her. Hearing those words, from someone who had once been a silent observer, meant more than she could articulate. She realized that her journey toward redemption wasn't going to be defined by the mistakes she had made, but by her willingness to face them, to confront her flaws, and to learn from them. As the weeks turned into months, Susan continued to push herself. She took every opportunity to engage with clients, to ask questions, and to understand their needs beyond the surface level. No longer did she rely solely on her instincts or assumptions. Instead, she listened more carefully, trying to see the full picture before making any judgments. There were still moments when she faltered, when doubts crept in, or when she caught herself making the same snap judgments that had caused her downfall. But each time, she paused, recalibrated, and reminded herself of the lessons she had learned. She no longer rushed to conclusions. She no longer assumed that appearance equaled worth. She had to see people as they truly were, not as she expected them to be. One particularly significant moment of growth occurred during a routine meeting with a potential new client. Susan had been tasked with overseeing the meeting, and she had prepared extensively, as she always did. When the client arrived, she was initially taken aback. The man was older, dressed in a faded suit that looked like it had seen better days. He carried a briefcase that looked worn and tattered, and his demeanor was quiet and unassuming. Her first instinct was to dismiss him, to write him off as someone who didn't have the resources the bank typically dealt with. But then she remembered Mr. Daniels, how she had judged him based on his appearance and been so completely wrong. She took a deep breath and pushed those assumptions aside. "Welcome," Susan said warmly, extending her hand to the man. "It's a pleasure to meet you." The man smiled faintly, shaking her hand. "Thank you, Miss Marley. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me." They sat down, and as the meeting progressed, Susan realized just how much she had misjudged this man at first glance. He was a small business owner, but one who had built a steady and reliable reputation in his field. His financials weren't flashy, but they were solid, and he had a clear vision for how he wanted to grow. He spoke with humility and a quiet determination that left a lasting impression on Susan. By the end of the meeting, Susan felt a deep respect for the man and his accomplishments. They didn't have the resources he needed for his vision just yet, but she promised him that the bank would stay in touch and explore potential options. It was a small victory, but it reinforced everything she had been working toward. The ability to see the true worth of a person, regardless of how they presented themselves. Susan left the meeting feeling lighter than she had in a long time. She knew that she had made progress, that she had not only proven herself to the bank, but had also demonstrated to herself that she could rise above her past mistakes. It was not about perfection. It was about growth. And every day, Susan Marley was growing. Her relationship with Mr. Taylor also began to shift. In the months following her second chance, he became more of a mentor than a superior. He often checked in with her, offering advice and guidance as she navigated the complexities of her role. There was a new level of mutual respect between them now, one that had been earned through hard work and a commitment to change. One afternoon, as Susan sat in her office, going over some final details for an important client presentation, Mr. Taylor walked in. His usual stern demeanor had softened over time, and Susan could tell that he was genuinely pleased with the progress she had made. "Susan, I just wanted to let you know that you've been doing a fantastic job lately," he said, his tone sincere. "I've been watching you closely, and I can see that you've truly taken the lessons to heart. The way you've turned things around, both for yourself and for this team, has been remarkable." Susan felt a surge of pride and gratitude. She had worked tirelessly to prove herself, and now finally, it seemed as though the fruits of her labor were beginning to show. "Thank you, Mr. Taylor," she replied, her voice filled with appreciation. "I couldn't have done it without the opportunity you gave me. I've learned so much from this experience, about leadership, humility, and the importance of seeing people for who they really are." Mr. Taylor nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad to hear that, and I think you're ready for something more. We have an important promotion opening up in a few months, and I want you to consider applying for it." Susan's heart skipped a beat. A promotion. After everything that had happened, she had come so far, and now she was being offered the chance to move forward, to grow even further in her career. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady, but her mind racing. She wasn't sure if she was ready for such a big step, but she knew that this was the ultimate test of her growth. Would she be able to step into a larger role with the same humility and dedication that had defined her recovery? As she looked out the window of her office, Susan smiled. The road to redemption had been long and difficult, but she had finally come to understand that mistakes didn't define her. It was how she learned from them that mattered. And now, more than ever, she was ready to face whatever came next. A test of character. As the months passed, Susan Marley's transformation continued, but she knew that the true test of her growth was yet to come. Her second chance at Blue Ridge Bank had been a gift, one that she had worked tirelessly to earn. But the challenges were far from over. The moment that Mr. Taylor had suggested she consider applying for a promotion, she felt a whirlwind of emotions. Part of her wanted to take the leap, to prove that she had fully redeemed herself. Another part hesitated, unsure if she was truly ready to carry the weight of a bigger responsibility. The promotion Mr. Taylor had hinted at was not just another job. It was a position that would require leadership, a sharp understanding of business, and the ability to manage people effectively. The thought of overseeing a larger team, handling critical financial decisions, and dealing with high-stakes clients was daunting. But then, Susan reminded herself of what she had learned. This wasn't just about ambition anymore. It was about being the person she had become, someone who was willing to face challenges with humility, someone who understood the importance of looking beyond the surface and truly understanding others. Every day at Blue Ridge Bank, Susan pushed herself further, refining the lessons she had learned from her past mistakes. She took extra steps to connect with colleagues and clients, understanding that leadership was not about asserting dominance, but about empowering those around her. She sought feedback constantly, checking in with her peers to gauge how she was doing and whether she could improve. In many ways, she had become a different person from the one who had walked into the bank months ago, full of ambition but blind to the realities of the world around her. But the true test of Susan's character came when a high-profile client, a powerful and influential businessman who was known for his ruthlessness in negotiations, walked into Blue Ridge Bank for a meeting. Mr. Daniels, still a trusted investor and an invaluable asset to the bank, had arranged the meeting as part of a major financial restructuring deal. The stakes were high, and everyone knew that if the meeting went well, it could secure the future of Blue Ridge Bank for years to come. However, if the negotiations faltered, it could lead to severe consequences for the institution. Susan had been selected to handle the meeting, a clear indication that Mr. Taylor trusted her abilities and saw potential in her leadership. But as she prepared, doubts began to creep in. The businessman, Mr. Richards, was known for his sharp tongue and intimidating presence. His reputation for undermining people who weren't tough enough was legendary, and Susan had heard stories of how he could break down even the most seasoned professionals in seconds. "Stay calm, stay collected," Susan repeated to herself in the mirror as she adjusted her suit. She was dressed for success, but her nerves were anything but steady. She knew that this was the kind of test that could either confirm her readiness for a promotion or expose the cracks in her newly rebuilt confidence. As she entered the boardroom, Mr. Taylor was already there, sitting with Mr. Richards. Both men turned to her as she walked in, their expressions unreadable. Mr. Taylor gave her a small nod of approval, but Mr. Richards did not acknowledge her presence at all. The silence in the room was palpable, and Susan knew this was no ordinary meeting. The pressure was on, and she had no choice but to deliver. "Mr. Richards," she began, trying to sound confident despite the butterflies in her stomach, "it's a pleasure to meet you. I've been looking forward to discussing the restructuring proposal with you. I believe it's a mutually beneficial arrangement, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts." Mr. Richards, a man in his late 50s with a stern, calculating expression, leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I'm not interested in pleasantries, Ms. Marley," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "I want to know what you're going to offer me. How is this deal going to benefit me?" Susan felt her heart race. She had expected the brash approach, but hearing it firsthand was another matter entirely. She steadied her breath, reminding herself that this was her moment to prove that she had learned from her mistakes, that she was ready for the responsibility that came with leadership. "The proposal you've received, Mr. Richards, is designed to align the interests of all parties involved," Susan continued, keeping her voice calm but firm. "But what matters most to you, as I understand, is securing long-term stability for your investments and ensuring that your ventures continue to grow. The restructuring plan is not just a financial adjustment. It's a strategic partnership that will allow you to expand your portfolio while minimizing risk." She watched his reaction carefully. Mr. Richards didn't seem particularly impressed, but he was listening. At least for the moment. The conversation moved forward, with Susan detailing the specifics of the plan and addressing each of his concerns. She had prepared for this meeting meticulously, ensuring that she could respond to his questions and objections without faltering. But what she hadn't anticipated was the way Mr. Richards would begin to challenge her directly, testing both her knowledge and her composure. After a particularly detailed explanation of the bank's financial outlook, Mr. Richards leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "You seem to know your numbers, but you don't know me, Ms. Marley," he said with a sneer. "I've been in this business long enough to spot someone who's trying too hard to please. You're nothing more than a puppet in this game. I want to see what you're really made of." His words hit like a punch to the gut. Susan's instincts screamed to back down, to let Mr. Taylor take the reins as he usually did when things got tough. But then, something inside her shifted. She had been tested by her failures before, and she knew now that the only way forward was to confront challenges head-on, not shrink from them. "I'm not trying to please you, Mr. Richards," Susan replied, her voice steady now, her confidence growing. "I'm here to make sure that everyone at this table, including you, gets a fair deal. My goal is to create something that benefits us all in the long run, not just a short-term solution." Mr. Richards stared at her, his gaze piercing. For a moment, Susan thought he might lash out, that he would throw his weight around and try to intimidate her into submission. But instead, he sat back, looking impressed, though he didn't show it in any overt way. Well, Ms. Marley," he said with a slow smile, "it seems you have a backbone after all." The meeting continued, and Susan held her ground, responding to every one of Mr. Richards' demands with grace and poise. By the time the meeting came to a close, the deal was sealed. Not only had she successfully navigated the negotiation, but she had also earned Mr. Richards' respect, something that no one had expected. As she left the boardroom, Susan felt a sense of triumph, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this victory was not just about the deal. It was about proving to herself that she was capable of handling the pressure, that she could stand firm in the face of adversity without losing sight of her values. She had faced her fear of failure and emerged stronger for it. Later that afternoon, Mr. Taylor called her into his office. He was standing by the window, looking out over the city, and when he turned to her, his face was unreadable. "You did well today, Susan," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I watched how you handled yourself in that meeting. You didn't let Mr. Richards intimidate you. You stayed focused on the goal and showed real leadership." Susan felt a surge of pride, but she kept her emotions in check. "Thank you, Mr. Taylor. It wasn't easy, but I knew that backing down wasn't an option." He nodded. "And that's why I believe you're ready for the promotion. You've earned it." Susan's heart skipped a beat. She had done it. She had proven that she was not just capable of overcoming her past mistakes, but that she was also capable of leading others with integrity and confidence. This promotion wasn't just a reward for her work. It was a testament to her growth, to the person she had become. As she left Mr. Taylor's office, Susan felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but each test had brought her closer to understanding what true leadership meant. She wasn't just taking on a new role at Blue Ridge Bank. She was stepping into a new chapter of her life, one where her character and her ability to learn from her mistakes would define her success.